Sadly, however, the comments about that administration are just as true about the current administration, so it's less dated than it might seem. Hopefully this one now, I think I'll turn down.
I don't believe my neighbors here in Jacksonville, my hometown since birth, have any idea how much trouble they are in, all of us in America are in.
So now we're in a period of crisis.
Question in the U.S. today is, why do they hate us? Well, that's a damn good question to be asked.
It's a very interesting question because when I first went to the Middle East in 1951, we were worshipped. We were looked at as the country of the only non-imperial great power.
Nobody hates the Americans. People certainly resent the American people.
We're in a deep hole because we're so heavily biased in favor of Israel, and the whole world knows it, and they're astounded by it. They can't comprehend why America, with its great cherished traditions, would close its eyes to the dreadful punishment that we have enabled Israel to inflict on virtually defenseless people.
We saw that what the Israelis had done was lock the doors of several classrooms that were on the second story and then throwing tear gas canisters in so that the kids panicked, and when they finally got out, jumped over the balcony there and landed on an asphalt area below, breaking many legs.
Anybody who's lived any amount of time in the Middle East begins to see the other side of it, I think.
I was arrested 9 times, so I've been repeatedly arrested and harassed. The first time I was arrested, I was 15 years old. The norm was physical torture. I mean, you get physically tortured until you faint, and then they will splash water in your face and start again. And that Israel calls moderate physical pressure. To me, it didn't look as moderate.
I think if Americans decided they want to support Israel, they want a congressman who supports Israel, I mean, obviously it's a free country and they're perfectly free to decide that, but they don't know that that's what they're supporting. And I think that's the problem.
Israel and the lobby, or Israel through the lobby, are really running a policy.
In fact, it's worse now than it's ever been before. We have a White House that's totally dominated by Israelis.
It's sad that the Americans, who are so concentrated on helping Israel, they don't give a hoot, as far as I'm concerned, about whether it hurts the United States or not.
Israel and her present policies, the Sharon policies, are undermining American security, they're undermining American policy.
I spoke with the head military of the United States, Joel Zinger, and I said, no, spent 2 weeks here. It's clear you people are inflicting Nuremberg crime on Palestinians. Exactly what the Nazis did to the Jews. What's your explanation? He said, military necessity. Notice, he didn't disagree with me. I said, that argument was rejected at Nuremberg in the ways the Nazis made. So then he said, well, we have public relations people in the United States, and they handle these matters for us.
Arabs and Muslims have to be made to look bad in America, and America has to be made to look bad today.
not too difficult to understand that bad things are going to happen to Israel, which I do not wish to see. Bad things are going to happen to the Palestinians. I don't want to see that either. Bad things are going to happen to the Americans, and that, above all, is what I wish you would see.
Almost nothing about Israel-Palestine. I don't happen to be Arab or Muslim or Palestinian or Jewish. My background is Presbyterian. And I was the editor of a very small newspaper in Northern California, in Sausalito, writing about the local school district, the fishing fleet. The Middle East seemed distant, confusing, and irrelevant to my daily life. And so, like most Americans, including the people on this campus tonight, I skimmed the headlines on this topic, accepted the confusion that I found, and I just moved on. We're all so busy. I did that for decades and decades. But finally, in fall of 2000, when my youngest son had just started college, I had a little more time, the Second Palestinian Uprising, as it's called, the Second Intifada, was briefly in the headlines. And I saw those images of children, sometimes literally throwing stones against tanks. And I finally decided to pay attention to learn what this was all about, to just follow the news on Israel-Palestine. And when I did that, I noticed something I should have noticed long before. I noticed how one-sided the news coverage was. I noticed that we heard from and about Israelis in great detail, as we should. I then expected to also hear from and about Palestinians in equivalent detail. I noticed that came much less frequently. We would sometimes get that. We sometimes still do. But far less often and far less thoroughly than we get information by and about Israelis. So I began to look into it more and more, and my curiosity 12 years ago is what changed my life and brought me here to you tonight. Now, one thing that all Americans sort of agree on is that the media are often biased or do a very poor job on reporting. Sometimes groups on opposite sides of an issue will both say that the news media are biased against them. Obviously, they're not both right. Sometimes both are wrong. Overall, I feel that most journalists are certainly trying to do a good job, and quite often are. I'm not against journalists, I'm a journalist. But sometimes those accusations are accurate, and they need to be studied. So we decided, If Americans Knew, a number of years ago, to do a study that could really quantify the situation. We chose to look at a category that would be universally acknowledged as significant and that was quantifiable. So we decided to study how the media covered deaths among both populations. The key is both populations. And I'd like to emphasize that tonight I will be talking about what the media leave out. I won't be taking your time and my time covering important events that are covered well. For example, suicide bombings are tragic on every conceivable level. When these have happened, they have been covered movingly and thoroughly by all newspapers and news, television and radio across the political spectrum. We know about them. Rockets from Gaza, similarly, are covered in almost every story that you will read about Israel-Palestine. You will read that there are rockets from Gaza. Therefore, that is well known to the American public. Anybody who has even glanced at this issue should know that. Interestingly, they never tell the number of people they have killed since they were first used in the end of 2001. The total is approximately 20 people. That is fewer than the number of people that Israeli forces killed in a few minutes in Gaza a few years ago. So we do hear about these rockets, but we don't learn some of the important details about them. So tonight I'll try to talk about the information that we're not getting. We decided to do a study on that, and we studied the major media and some local media as well. Chose a category that was significant and quantifiable, which is death among both populations. The first thing we needed to do to evaluate the coverage, you need a baseline. If you don't know what's going on in an area, you cannot evaluate the coverage. So we needed to know how many people were killed during that first year. We decided to emphasize two periods. The first year of the current uprising, because first impressions are so powerful. We all know that. They set the context within which we ever after view a conflict. They determine for us who is the aggressor and who is defending their population. Then we looked at more recent data to see if the patterns continue. So how many people were killed that very first year by the other side? Using an Israeli organization, we discovered that 165 Israelis were killed by Palestinians, 549 Palestinians were killed by Israelis. How was this covered by our prime-time network news shows, ABC, CBS, and NBC? Well, they reported on Israeli deaths at rates up to 3 and 4 times greater than they reported on Palestinian deaths. Some of you may be wondering, how could they exceed 100% coverage? We were counting every time there was a report about a death for both populations, including follow-up reports. If there was a news report about families burying loved ones, for example, that was counted as well. Therefore, we knew that in theory the coverage could exceed 100%. We were astounded to see, and have seen numerous times since, that it frequently exceeds 100% for Israelis, and it never comes close for Palestinians. Then we looked at a subcategory that is even more significant, the killing of children. All populations on Earth feel that children are illegitimate targets of strife. They should not be killed. When we learn about their deaths, I believe we are deeply horrified and saddened, no matter the race, nationality, or ethnicity of that child. This is particularly newsworthy. So how many children were killed that first year by the other side? Again, using an Israeli source, well-regarded, we learned that 28 Israeli children had tragically been killed by Palestinians, and 131 Palestinian children at least had tragically been killed by Israelis. How was this covered by our prime-time network news shows? Well, they reported on Israeli children's deaths at rates up to 13 and 14 times greater than they reported on the equally tragic killing of Palestinian children. Another way of looking at that is this chart, where the dark blue in the Israeli column are the number of reports on Israeli children's deaths that exceeded the number of deaths that actually occurred, giving people the impression more are being killed than actually are because we hear about them so often. Whereas for the Palestinian population, we see the opposite going on. We see a vast empty column of Palestinian children killed by Israelis whose parents no doubt are still grieving for them that we never even learned about. Another way of looking at our data is this chart. This is from our study of the New York Times, the quote newspaper of record for the United States, perhaps the most important newspaper in the world, potentially, certainly arguably in this country. In this case, we decided to graph our data chronologically for that first year, for those first 12 months. This first curve, this blue line, is the New York Times prominent reporting on Israeli children killed by Palestinians in the course of those first 12 months. Next, we'll see the actual death curve of Israeli children that first year. And as you can see, it's lower because the New York Times also had a number of follow-up stories, but it's a similar curve. Next, we'll see the New York Times